Our next speaker is going to take us a little bit different direction. Bruce Logan, the CAPI Professor of Environmental Engineering at Penn State. And Bruce is Bruce again, different Bruce though, is going to push us now in a different direction, talking about microbial electrochemical technologies and how they can address our salinity gradient issue. Salinity is another of the major problems that we're going to face in the coming decades. Bruce.
Well, thanks very much. I'm really pleased to be here to be able to talk about this today. I always like to put power on a scale. People talk about megawatts, gigawatts, and things, and let's put it on a more personal scale. We eat about 2,000 calories or 2,000 kilocalories a day. How many 100-watt light bulbs is that like? You know, running continuously. You think 5, 10, or something like that. Must be a lot, but actually it's one. And so just to put the scale of energy demands on something that we can relate to every day, it's like one 100-watt light bulb running continuously. Now, we're not perfect. Some of that goes down the drain. That's about 25 watts, which is equivalent to a modern compact fluorescent light. So that would be great if we could power all our needs on that wastewater. We can't. We use a lot more for our homes, for our cars and industry and so forth. And when you get done, we use about 100 times that. So just think in terms about the food that we eat. If we were trying to do a real food bioeconomy, we'd need to grow 100 times more food in very rough terms. So what we've been doing is researching technologies that make use of the wastes we already make. These are microbial fuel cells, and the idea is that with no moving parts, we can convert organic matter into electricity. The only moving part in this case is that fan. There's no moving parts inside that microbial fuel cell. And what's really inside there are just bacteria that are able to break down organic matter. Like you and I, when we eat, we breathe, we capture electrons out of that food, and then those electrons flow through our respiratory enzymes, and we make energy, and then we release those electrons to oxygen. We keep bacteria in a situation where they can't get at the oxygen, and so they can break down their organic matter and release those electrons to an electrode, where they flow through a circuit to the cathode. It's a thermodynamically spontaneous situation. And we can develop reactors that are very simple. This one that is sort of like the average test tube of our laboratory is more like 2 electrodes in a tube. It's very, very simple. Now, we've talked a little bit about the energy for wastewater treatment. We've gone in the direction of using more energy for wastewater treatment, using more energy for drinking water, primarily due in part to using membrane-based processes, taking nothing away from Perry's talk today, which I thought was excellent. But there's also a lot of energy in that wastewater, 2 to 5 kilowatt hours per cubic meter. And if you also look at the energy difference between a typical freshwater and seawater, there's probably another 0.5 to 1 kilowatt hour per cubic meter. Now that's not a high energy density, but we have a lot of water. And I'll talk also about creating artificial salinity gradients using waste heat. Now, these are revolutionary ideas, and every idea goes through what they say is 3 stages. The first one's that of denial. It can't be done. And then, hopefully you work on it a little bit more and they say, well, it's possible, but it's not worth doing. And then you hope you get to the 3rd stage, which is where they said, I said it was a good idea all along. Perhaps this has happened with different water technologies, reverse osmosis membranes. Nah, that's never going to work, too expensive. Membrane bioreactors, that's a foolish idea to put membranes in wastewater. That'll never catch on. And maybe microbial fuel cells will be that next area. So what I want to do is zip through some of the technology advances which hopefully will make this possible. We've made a lot of progress in the past few years, and so I want to give you a sense of that. We've built all sorts of these systems, looking all different ways, and here's what we've come out with in the end. Ways to make a very inexpensive architecture. Some papers were written talking about we needed to get these costs down below 100 euros per square meter or $150 per square meter, and we've done that. You start with the tank. I'm not going to put in the cost of the tank because everything needs a tank. You put the wastewater in that tank, an anode where the bacteria are going to grow, a cathode where oxygen is reduced. You want to have that done passively with air, and so you need something to make the water not leak out through the cathode. That's called a diffusion layer. And then you want to move your anode close to the cathode because that will create more power, but you don't want them to touch, so you put in an insulator or a separator between those two things. Now, the cathode is probably the most expensive part of this contraption, typically made out of carbon cloth with some sort of catalyst. That's historically has been platinum, and then some sort of binder, typically Nafiion's been used. And so the challenge was that if you did all that, it cost you about $2,000 to build 1 square meter of this stuff, which is way too expensive. And so what I'll do is show you that we can get the cost down to about $40 or $50 per square meter of materials, and I obviously won't go into those details, but let me convince you that we can do that. And the other thing is we got to make these things very compact. We have to put a lot of square meters of electrode per cubic meter. And so the idea is to create sort of different pathways for the water and very thin pathways for the air to create this sort of modular development where every square meter of module then meets with another square meter. And if you get each one of these is 10 centimeters wide, and you have 10 of them per cubic meter. You got 10 square meters per cubic meter, or if you got 100, you got 100 square meters per cubic meter, and so forth. So how do we make this system simple and affordable? The first was for the anode, we use something that looks like a bottle brush. It's just carbon fibers wound around a non-corrosive titanium wire. Huge surface area for bacteria, and very electrically conductive. So we can modify that design now that I showed to have sort of these brushes about the system. The second thing is we got away from needing to use platinum. Activated carbon, something environmental engineers know a bit about, but in a different context, activated carbon is actually a very good catalyst for oxygen reduction at the current densities that we use. And so these activated carbon catalysts work about as well as platinum on carbon cloth. The cathode surface area is really becomes the critical design feature in the system, and that is that the more cathode area you put for volume, the more power that you make. And so we've shown this with a number of different systems. It's really a question about cathode area. So once you know how much cathode area you can put in the system, you can pretty much predict how much power you're going to make. Let me skip that slide, per volume. Now, activated carbon works well, but it doesn't last forever, and one of our big challenges was that over time we would see this performance for oxygen reduction creeping down, and these were some tests Fang Zhang did in my lab. She conducted them for about a year. I asked her to do this for 10 years, but she said no, so we only have a year of data. We noticed that biofilms grew on these systems over time. So the question is, well, let's just remove the biofilms and we'll be in good shape. And so if you look, here's the original system, and then after 1 year, we're down here. These are just 2 different types of activated carbon cathodes. And what you see is that if we clean it, it goes up a little bit, but it doesn't restore it. If we put in a new one, we get back virtually the same amount of power. And this is how the anode or the bacteria look. You don't have to worry about what's going on here, but basically this says that after 1 year, the bacteria are doing exactly the same job that they did a year ago. That is, nature, after a year, is still working perfectly. Our activated carbon cathodes, unfortunately, are not. So we need to improve, but nature has done well. And so these are some new cathodes we've designed based on activated carbon. Up here in the green is platinum when they're brand new, and this orange, the platinum is orange, and the green is the activated carbon, one of our better designs here. And you can see after a month, the platinum has dropped way down. After 2 months, the platinum is actually getting fouled and doing a worse job. But these new activated carbon ones are showing very little degradation over a couple of months. So we're very optimistic about these new cathodes. The binder that people typically use to hold activated carbon or other catalysts together are very are negatively charged, which tends to get positive charge accumulating there, which rejects protons, which you don't want to do. We've created a new binder that over many cycles seems very stable and is actually much cheaper than the current binders. These would be the binders that would hold on the catalyst. And the separators, the things that keep the space between the electrodes, we had used some cloths. We had problems. These worked pretty well, but they degraded over time. These started to unravel. And there was also problems of keeping oxygen away from the bacteria, because the more power that we got, the less electrons, is called Coulombic efficiency, the less electrons we got actually into the circuit. And so what we really wanted was something up here. And so we struggled for a little while to solve that problem. And recently we have some data which is showing that we can get some separators right up in this area as well. So, you know, we think we have put the materials together that can make this system work. And unfortunately, we haven't done all those things all together at once. We hope to do those, but that's the way research goes. So what else? You know, say we've done this now, we've got these materials, how well can it work on actual wastewater? So originally we looked at building one of these systems with flat anodes and flat cathodes and treating the wastewater. We compared it to our graphite fiber brushes, and we found that over about 100 days of operation, we got good continued performance out of our brushes, but this flat surface didn't work so well. So that told us two things. One is we could get good treatment on wastewater, and two, it would be stable over time. However, wastewater is not acetate. Acetate gives us much more power than wastewater does. That's just got to lower our expectation about the kind of power we can get out of these systems, but we can get power out. These are some typical wastewater properties. I won't go into detail here other than to say it pretty much behaves as it should. And what sort of removals do we get? Well, our influent BODs are equivalent to about 200 milligrams per liter. Our effluent are not down at 6, but about 30 or 40 milligrams per liter. This is intrinsically a biofilm process, and so it behaves much like a trickling filter would in terms of getting soluble BOD out. But, you know, we figured out how to do that. You know, activated sludge gets low effluent BODs, but a trickling filter solids contact process can do the same thing. That solids contact process can drop the BOD down further. Perhaps we could do the same thing with microbial fuel cells. So where are we in scaling this system up? We don't build very big systems generally in the lab. This is about the biggest system we built. It's 2 liters, and we did that mostly for demonstration purposes, not to really treat wastewater. And recently we've been building some other systems which have allowed us to tackle some of the engineering aspects of this, notably the fact that we have multiple electrodes in the system. And so we start to pack this reactor with many of these electrodes, and when we did that, some very bad things happened. Namely, it didn't work so well. So this is the system all wired up, all these anodes wired up together, and it produced very little power. And we didn't expect that, so we had to figure out why. So we individually wired these anodes to the cathode, so now we have 3 circuits, 1 for each anode. And then we just tried flowing the wastewater through 2 reactors or multiple reactors instead of 2 1 8-hour, we have 2 4-hour reactors. And there's our very little power part. There's our multiple electrodes. You can see the first one has more power, the second one less, and the third one less. But when we get small COD changes over this system, and we have these reactors running in series, we can actually do a much better job of producing power. And so we didn't know until we started actually building these multiple electrode systems, but we're going to have these things in series, and if we do that, then we can drive the system in a better direction of wastewater treatment. So for low wastewater concentrations, we've started to deal with the fact that, yes, we can build multiple electrode systems, multiple reactors, as long as we keep the HRT short, the hydraulic retention times. Another thing we had to deal with was how to effectively capture power out of these systems. And so a couple of my research group came up with this idea, and this is sort of like throwing equations up here. Throw an electrical circuit up in front of a bunch of water people. But let me just say that what happens is these reactors charge two capacitors, and then we switch the capacitors to discharge. But when we discharge them in series. And like batteries all linked together, you can increase the voltage. And so even a single MFC, instead of producing about a half a volt, can produce 2 or 2.5 volts, depending on the number of capacitors in the circuit. So we figured out how to harness this energy through capacitance systems and to effectively get multiple electrode systems to work. One of the things about making electricity is it's still very cheap. And so the question becomes, how can you make a profit at doing this, or how can you break even for the cost of the electrodes if you're making something which costs very little? Well, we can get pretty high current densities, but the value of our product is not very high. So we thought, well, what if we make something worth more like hydrogen? If you take one of these microbial fuel cells and you take away the oxygen in the system, nothing happens. But if you add a little bit of power to that is, you add some voltage to the circuit, actually you can evolve hydrogen gas at the cathode. So this is a way, as Bruce was talking about, to use this microbial fuel cell type technology to make hydrogen. And actually, it's a much simpler system to make hydrogen than to have oxygen reduction on the cathode. We've built some of these reactors in the lab here. We have built reactors around about 2.5 liters for this one, made of multiple electrodes and multiple cathodes. We've built a larger system up in, and we tested this at a winery in Napa, California, and that's what you do at Pennsylvania. If you don't want to be there in the winter, you go to California and test your ideas at a winery. We got, these are the 24 modules, and you can see our current densities weren't always as what we'd hoped for, but we were doing pretty well there, and we were treating the wastewaters. And a group in Newcastle has also shown this idea of, they put this microbial electrolysis cell on a wastewater treatment plant, and they were able to produce hydrogen from domestic wastewater as well and treat the wastewater. So the last part of my lecture, I got 8 minutes left there. Yeah, close enough. Good. Okay, good. So the last thing I'm going to do is, now I've told you the microbial fuel cells, or the microbial electrochemical technologies. Let me tell you how they meet salinity gradient energy. Salinity gradient energy is the energy you could extract where fresh water flows into salt water, and that's been estimated to be globally somewhere around 2 terawatts available, with maybe 1 terawatt that we might possibly harvest. And there's also a lot of energy in waste heat. Every power plant that puts out a gigawatt of electricity wastes 2 gigawatts of waste heat. So we ought to be able to find better ways to capture that energy. So salinity gradient energy. You've got salt water. That looks kind of nice. It'd be right out the window. We're not out there, but we're in here. Unfortunately, you have to listen to me. But there are lots of places where you have fresh water flowing into that sea, or you have, for example, wastewater flowing into the ocean. Now, if you put that on a hydro energy basis, like water flowing over a dam, how much energy difference are we talking about between these two sources? Well, that fresh water flowing into seawater is like water falling over a 270-meter high dam, or almost 1,000 feet. That's the energy that you could capture. And if you think about it, it makes sense. You have to squeeze fresh water out of salt water. That takes a tremendous amount of energy. That's like, running uphill. But if you're uphill and you can go downhill with no energy, that's energy to be captured, and that's salinity gradient energy that could be captured. Now, you may be familiar with electro dialysis. You take 2 electrodes, you apply a big voltage on the water with selective membranes. All the negative charge wants to go in that direction. All the positive charge wants to go in that direction. So if everything starts out as seawater, you eventually get more diluted and more concentrated solutions, because the positive charge can get out that way and the negative one can go that way, but it can't go any further. So it tends to create these fresh and salt water concentrate systems. Reverse electrodialysis is, well, the reverse. You put seawater in one cell and river water in the other cell, and anions can only go that direction, and cations can only go in that direction. And that creates an electrochemical potential of about 0.1 to 0.2 volts for every pair of membranes. You can harvest electrical current by linking these membranes together, much like you can just link batteries together. So you take a series of these membranes, and if you have enough of them, you could split water on one side, releasing oxygen at the anode, and turn the electrons and protons into hydrogen at the other electrode. This has been known for a long time, but you need a lot of membranes to do it. So we thought, well, what if we took this stack and we took just a few of these membranes and we put them into one of our microbial fuel cells and made it into what we call a microbial reverse electrodialysis. Now you know why we say it MRC. So MRC is an MFC with this stack inside of it. And we tested this idea out to see how well we'd capture that energy. And when we put it in the microbial fuel cell, instead of making a half a volt, we made 1.3 volts because of the stack potential. Instead of making about a half a watt per square meter, we made 4.5 watts per square meter. And the energy efficiency, 42%, well, that's better than a power plant burning coal. Last point then is waste heat energy. How can we possibly use these ideas to capture energy from waste heat? If you start with a solution like ammonium bicarbonate and you apply a low waste heat to this system at temperatures 40, 50, 60 degrees C, below boiling, you can distill off the ammonia and the CO2, much like you distill off alcohol out of water, except you have to boil the water. So this is much lower heat. So you condense out those materials, you create a high concentrate, the water that's left is your low concentrate. So you've just taken that waste heat and made a salty and a non-salty solution. And if freshwater seawater is a 270 meter tall dam, then this one is a 370 meter tall dam or more. And we tried this idea out on wastewater, domestic wastewater. We put the stack into the microbial fuel cell. And we found out that instead of making that much power from wastewater, we made almost 3 watts per square meter, about almost 10 times what we were producing before. And something scientifically amazing happened. It's like Perry saying, we didn't expect the GAC to clean the membranes. We didn't expect this to happen. Our electrode potential stayed nearly flat. And what that means is you can produce more and more power for as long as you keep these things flat. When they start going up and going down and meeting each other, then power generation stops. And so we found out that we could not only make a lot more power, but we also could do it in a lot less time. So that gives us a potential to make electricity. We can also use this ammonium bicarbonate as a way to make, as our sort of energy source to make hydrogen. That means that instead of having to go to an electrical grid energy source and get that voltage we need, we can get that voltage from the stack. And indeed, we've done some tests which show this hydrogen production with no electrical grid energy. This can be done, of course, abiotically or biotically, but we think that the biotic rolls have a way to form useful products from a cheap source of organic matter, which we currently call wastewater. The energy efficiencies can be very high. We've gotten as high as 65% energy efficiency in some of these systems, although quite distant from wastewater, but it shows great promise. So I just want to finish up and say I think we now have these materials that we can use this to make these systems. We don't have operational experience. We don't have enough experience building these larger systems, but we need that. And the salinity gradient energy is just a whole new thing that we ought to be thinking about anytime we throw fresh water into salt water. I'd like to acknowledge the people that have done this work. I can't acknowledge everybody. This is my current group of students at Penn State. And if you want to know more about this, you can buy my book, or as I've been told, you can go online and read it for free. And there's some YouTube, Twitter, and so forth links. And anyway, thank you very much for listening.